Paper 3, Issues and Debates, Culture Bias. So if we think back to last year's content, most of our studies we looked at took place in America. Lots of Western studies, 64% of the world's psychologists are American. In 1991, textbook on social psychology, 94% of the studies were conducted in North America. So we are thinking about culture bias. So a tendency to ignore cultural differences, interpret all phenomena through the lens of one's own culture. So there are lots of different key terms that we need for this, a few that we've looked at already. Imposed ethic, imposed emic, for example. And these look like this. So starting with what culture actually is, beliefs and customs of a group, such as how they bring up their children, their views on sexual stereotypes. Culture is going to be different everywhere. From there, we move on to ethnocentrism. This is where you believe that where you come from and your research is superior of one's own ethnic and cultural group. And therefore, this is the standard that we will measure every culture against, which leads into something called ethic or imposed ethic constructs. We will look at factors, a behaviour from outside of the culture. We analyse those behaviours on a universal, so we think that our way is the best way and therefore we'll find those behaviours everywhere. Emic, however, so imposed emic, is actually where you are going into that specific culture and you understand that they vary. So even better, you are a researcher from that culture and doing that research, but you're not trying to assume or apply what you have learned about that culture everywhere. So it's better to look at the behaviour from the inside of that cultural system. And then cultural relativism is basically saying that unless the behaviour is being viewed in the context of the culture, behaviour can't be judged. So it has to be within that, very similar to emic constructs. It's relative to where that individual group live. Now, psychology has been argued to take this imposed emic approach, assuming that we are looking for a universal concept, but actually we should be using emic constructs to look at specific cultures. Okay, so that's all AO1. So how do we use issues and debates? If we think back to a year 12 topic, so we'll look at ASH and conformity, we would have pretty much answered the question a bit like this. We'd have our issue or our point. This is what I'm saying as my example. The sample consists of male college students. We'd explain that by saying that we can't generalise, and then we'd link it by being like, can't draw conclusions, therefore we have issues. So that's a typical before issues and debates AO3 paragraph. When you're using issues and debates, and I want to see issues and debates everywhere, I say to my sort of AA star students, yes, you're looking for 3 pill paragraphs with some however statements. I'd also want a 4th paragraph with issues and debates, or 3 paragraphs with however statements, adding in issues and debates as you go. And this would look like this. So same point, same example, but here we would then say how ASH is showing beta bias. They're minimising the difference between males and females. It's a very biased view, an androcentric view. It matters then because we can't generalise. Therefore, we struggle to draw conclusions. So you're bulking up your explanation with issues and debates, using those lovely key terms to really highlight that you know your stuff. It just makes you look like a much better candidate. So types of questions that we might see around culture bias. Issues and debates generally have smaller questions within them. So I have seen it where there has been a 16 marker and an 8 marker, or there's been no 16 markers and lots of smaller questions. Like this, briefly outline 2 examples, discuss cultural bias with a stem there, or, like we said, referring to 2 topics. Regardless, if your 16 marker was this, cultural bias, you will need to add in topics from the course. Even if they've not mentioned it, like they have here, that's how you gain your marks for your AO3. So if we think back to some specific examples then that highlight some cultural bias, the DSM, what we use are statistical manual where mental disorders are kept. We're on DSM-5 now. This is a American produced manual that we use in the UK, but it does vary depending on where you are. We think back to depression and also schizophrenia, where, you know, in some cultures it's good to hear voices, it's like our ancestors, but in the UK we would diagnose someone with schizophrenia. It's the same with depression. It's a sign of weakness, potentially, in some cultures, whereas, you know, if the Western researcher was using it, they would diagnose it regardless. So we're seeing we're not looking at cultural traditions using the DSM. Secondly, any IQ test that we may use, like Yerkes and Yerkes-Dodson law. Generally, it shows that lower IQ scores for Eastern European immigrants back in pre-war. I think DSM would be a good one to remember. And strange situation, she applied what she knew to everywhere, as well as the 3 attachment types, but we know there's a 4th. So we're seeing some imposed ethic. And Milgram. So in Milgram's study, all American males, yes, we're seeing a gender bias, but also factors that may just be specific to America. In the 50s, authority, respect, you know, very obedient society. We might not see that if that study was conducted in, you know, Killiman Man, when they replicated it in Australia, only 16% obedience. So it's, again, suffering from that imposed ethic. So how do we evaluate this idea of culture bias? Well, culture bias is generally associated with individualistic cultures. They have more value freedom, whereas collectivist cultures tend to put the groups of the needs first. So then the issue that we have is that cultural bias is quite because we have such a wide variety of cultures around the world. Here, in this study, 14 out of 15 compared USA with Japan, no evidence of a distinction between them. So do we have culture bias? Does it still exist? If we are becoming more multicultural and blending societies, is there such a thing as culture bias anymore? So it calls that into question. This idea of relativism and universality, it should not be assumed that all psychology is relative. There's no such thing as a universal human behaviour. And critiques of Ainsworth need to realise that imitation is universal. We do have some things that we do see. Emotion and facial expressions for happiness and sadness are universal. We see that everywhere. So this balance between being relative and universality, in some instances, we will find universality. In others, it will be culturally relative. So it's kind of taking it on a case-by-case basis. And then the unfamiliarity with research tradition, I can go back, is basically saying that you need to be part of that culture to really understand it. And, you know, in attachment, Jin in Cultural Differences was a Korean researcher, so was able to fully understand how Korean children are raised. So you've got to be from that culture in order to fully gain a picture of how that society works. Again, here you've got a snapshot of a question 16 marker here into culture bias, things you could put in for AO3, different areas from the topics you can discuss, again from gender, from attachment, and then those keywords for your AO1.